All right, Rabbosai, good morning, good morning. Let us begin a Gittin Chodesh, a great schos Baruch Hashem to be able to learn daf today on this last day of, first day of Rosh Chodesh, but last day of Chodesh Sivan. So we thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the Shuman Roshos this month as the schos for Shalima of Kathy's sister, Donna Baker Matson. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin Fleischman, in memory of his father, Rabbi Shmuel Yudel, Ben Binyamin Yaakov Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kol Cholei Yisrael have a completed enduring refuah, and then Shamas will have an aliyah. The families in a chama. But with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Lamed Dalid 34, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Lamed Gimel Amud Beis 33b. 3 lines up from the bottom. Rava says, supposed to remember again yesterday's daf, we had a series of very exciting machloksim. So the Gemara says like this: Rava Amar, supposed to, the way we ended off yesterday was, in one case, halacha follows Rebbe, and in the second case, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. And now the Gemara says as follows: Rava Amar Rav Nachman, halacha ki Rebbe b'shtehen. In fact, halacha really follows Rebbe in both cases. So both say, remember again, just to orient now a little bit of a shift. What that would mean is as follows. In case number one was the case of Bitlo, which was, remember again, halacha l'maisa Rabbi Gamliel made a takana. One more time, what was Rabbi Gamliel's takana? That you can't go ahead and be mevatel the get in front of a beis din, not in the presence of the shaliach or the wife. Right? So now the shaila, of course, was if you did it. So what's the impact of your actions? Rebbe says it works. In other words, bitlo mevotel. So now Rav Nachman is saying that halacha, Rav is saying that Rav Nachman, halacha follows Rebbe. Bitlo, if you did it, although you shouldn't have done it, if you did it, it works. That's number one. Number two thing that Rebbe said was that if you appoint a group to do something, you can go ahead and be mevatel part of the group, not in the presence of the entire group. So therefore, Rav is suggesting that in both cases, the halacha follows Rebbe. V'les Rav Nachman makoach beis yafa. Now also remember again, going back to the first case, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel argued on Rebbe. Remember again, why did he argue on Rebbe? Because he felt that if you're going to allow a husband to go ahead and be mevatel the get in front of just like a pop-up beis din somewhere, not in the presence of the isha and not in the presence of the shaliach, in defiance of the takana, of the enactment of Rabbi Gamliel, then what good is the power of beis din? Literally, again, imkain, if so that this will work, ma koach beis din yafa. What power does beis din have if you could defy them and your defiance creates halachic realities? So now the Gemara says, does Rav Nachman not subscribe to that principle? After all, v'ham Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Suppose you listen to this. Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel as follows: top of Lamed Dalet, Yisomim sheba'u lachlot benichse avihen. If you have, it was actually an interesting case. If you have Yisomim, father dies, and he leaves behind heirs, sons, but they're ketanim, they're minors. So what happens? So now they want to divide up the estate. The problem is they're minors. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. Beis din ma'amid lahen apotropos. So Beis din sets over them an apotropos. We'll say apotropos essentially is like a guardian / executor. So in other words, each katan is given an apotropos, someone who is there, whose job it is to advocate on their behalf, to go ahead and make sure that they get a favorable portion. And ultimately, again, that apotropos is there to go ahead and choose for them a proper portion. So we'll say, so now what happens? Let's say now the Yisomim get older, they grow up, Baruch Hashem, and they're unhappy with what the apotropos chose for them. So higdilu, now they grow up, Yecholin limchos, they have the ability to object to the portion they received, and they have the ability to say, look, you know what, we're not happy with what we got. We're not happy. So Rav Nachman himself says, higdilu, ein yecholin limchos. No. If when the kids get older, they are unable to object to what the apotropis chose for them. Why? The imkain makoach bezin yafa. Because if the children have the ability to object to the portion they received from the court-appointed custodian and guardian, then what good is the power of Beis Din? So I was saying, what's the point? The point over here is, you see, Rav Nachman himself subscribes to this concept of imkain makoach bezin yafa. So therefore he's saying, once Beis Din appoints the apotropis helps the katan secure a portion in inheritance. The katan grows up. Zeh katan gadol yiyeh, right? So he goes there, he grows up. Now he's an adult. He can't object to what he got, because when Beis Din does something, Beis Din does something. That's it. So you see that Rav Nachman subscribes to this idea. If that's the case, then how can Rav Nachman say that the halacha follows Rebbe, that bitlo muvotol, that if the husband goes ahead and just gets together a pop-up Beis Din, is mevatel the get, not in the presence of the wife, not in the presence of the shaliach, that it should work? Doesn't that undermine the authority of Beis Din? To which the Gemara says, no. Both say, 34a, 5 lines down. Hasam mamona, hacha isura. To which the Gemara says, say something amazing. It's two different cases. The case that we were just talking about over here, of the apotropsin, right, of the kids, is talking about a case of mammon, of money. Here it's talking about a case of isser. In other words, Rabbi say, when it comes to monetary decisions, the Gemara says, whatever Beis Din decides, that's what's going to stand. Rabbi say, now why is that? Rashi points out over here, because of hefker, Beis Din hefker. Remember again, we have a concept that in general, Beis Din has the ability to decide realities when it comes to monetary law. Right? And therefore, in this case over here, where Beis Din appointed a court agent, an apotropis, to help the katan find the proper portion, either katan grows up and he doesn't like what he got, too bad, right? That's the way it's going to work. The correct Beis Din helped adjudicate this settlement. We're done. Beis Din has control over all monetary matters. We'll say, go back for just a second. In the case of get, right, Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says that really you should not go ahead and convene a pop-up Beis Din to be mavatal the get, not in the presence of the wife or of the shaliach. Okay, fine. We totally understand why. Bibnei tikun ha'olam. Let me ask you this. If midaraisa, we already said midaraisa, if a husband did it, does it work? So we'll say, because it works, midaraisa, you can't go ahead and say that in order to go ahead and secure the integrity of Beis Din, we're going to say it's not going to work. It doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. It's wrong. But since midaraisa it works and it's isser, in other words, we'll say, what are you going to say? You're going to say that halacha l'maisa, the get ultimately. The get is effective when midaraisa it's not, right? That's what you're going to do. You're going to allow her to get remarried based on the fact that you don't like the fact that he went ahead and convened the pop-up Beis Din, going to let him get married when midaraisa, the get itself is absolutely void. That doesn't make sense. Now, both say, now in fairness, the Gemara kind of addressed this already. So the Gemara already addressed the fact that according to Rabbi Shmuel Silber, when he says imkein makoach Beis Din yafa, remember, even Rabbi Shmuel Silber is not really saying the get is valid, right? Remember again, what was Rabbi Shmuel Silber saying? What do we see in yesterday's daf? He was saying hafkas kiddushin, right? Even he was agreeing that the get is not valid, but rather he was saying that Chazal are going to penalize him and dissolve his kiddushin retroactively. Okay, fine. So we'll say, point over here is, so let's kind of circle the wagons over just a second. So remember, essentially what we have over here is Rava saying in the name of Rav Nachman that the halacha follows Rebbe in both of these cases. Therefore, if you convene the pop-up Beis Din, you shouldn't have done it, but if you did it, it works. That's number one. And number two, if you appoint a group to do something, even though ideally, if you are canceling the agency of some of the members, you should do it in front of the entire group. But if you did not do it in front of the entire group, the cancellation of the partial agency is still going to work. Fine. Couple of stories. Listen to this. Gidel bar Eloi, Shirley Gidel this was an interesting case, really interesting case. Gidel bar Eloi, that's his name, sent a get to his wife. Azal shlicha. So listen to this. We'll say now he sent it with the shlech. So Gidel, husband, sending a get to his wife. We'll just call her wife. Right? He sends the get with a shaliach. Fine. Ashkicha dahavayasva v'navla. So we'll say. So what happens? So shliach finds wife. Shliach finds Mrs. Gidel, and what happens? He finds that she's weaving. Amrla. So hagitech. He says, so listen, I'm here. I'm your husband's agent to deliver your get. Amralei zil hashtamiha v'salamachar. So Mrs. Re'ilai, right, Mrs. Gidl, says to the shliach, do me a favor, it's not a convenient time right now, I'm kind of busy. Come back tomorrow. Come back tomorrow. Give me my get tomorrow. Okay. Shaliach leaves. Azl gabe. So the shliach comes back to Gidl bar Re'ilai, tells him exactly what it is that occurred. V'amrlei, pasach v'amar, baruch hatov ha'metiv. Interesting. So we'll say, so essentially, so Gidl bar Re'ilai hears that the shliach didn't give the get, and what does he say? Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Literally, Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv. Blessed is God who is good and bestows good. So we'll say, so now, what's going on over here? Right. So now, essentially, Gidl bar Re'ilai is saying, I'm so happy you didn't give the get. Right. But here's the chap. He's not saying it in those words. Right. All he's saying is Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv. Again, he's saying Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem, you didn't give the get. Okay. So we'll say, so now what is this? Abaye Amar Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv lo bitel gita. So Abaye says, okay, he went ahead and he said Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv, but this is not a bit. He's not mevatel the get. In other words, we'll see this in just a moment. In other words, he's saying Baruch Hashem, but the get is still a valid get. The shlichus is still a valid shlichus, and if the shliach were to go back tomorrow and give it to her, she would be divorced. Rava Amar Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv ubatel gita. So Rava says, no. When Gidl bar Re'ilai says, ultimately again, Baruch Hatov Ha'metiv, ultimately he's being mevatel the get. Now, remember again, once again, when we say mevatel the get, what is he really doing? What is he really doing? Being mevatel the shlichus. Okay, so what are they arguing about? This is incredible. So the Gemara says, Begilui daita begittin kamiflagi. Rabbi say this is absolutely incredible. Rabbi say we are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. About 13 lines down from the top, Lamed Daled Amadal 34, 8. And both say, now listen to this. What are they arguing about? So both say, this is incredible. Begilui daita begittin kamiflagi. Both say, what's gilui das? What's gilui das? Gilui das means an expression of intent. Now both say, now listen to this. Now we have the concept of gilui das in many areas of halacha. Here what it means is like this. What happens when someone says something that is an expression of intent, but it's not an explicit expression of intent? So we'll say, here's a perfect example, right? So Gidl bar Re'ilai sent the shaliach to deliver the get. Shaliach comes back. He says, listen, your wife told me to come back tomorrow. All right? Gidl bar Re'ilai says, Baruch Hashem. Now we'll say, we're pretty sure. What does it mean when he says Baruch Hashem? What does it mean? What does it mean? He's happy, right? He changed his mind. Doesn't want to give the get. We'll say, but what's missing? What's missing? Explosivity, right? In other words, explicitness. It's not explicit. So we'll say that's called gilui das. That's called an expression of intent, right? An expression of intent, but it's not an explicit expression of intent. So I will say, so what do you do with that? So the Gemara wants to suggest that's a machlokes Abaye and Rava. Abaye says gilui das, an expression of intent, is nothing. It's nothing. In other words, say what you mean. Say what you mean and say it clearly. We're not going to start inferring from your words in order to create the halachic reality. If you want to change realities, Rabbi say, you must be explicit with your words. That's Abaye. And Rava says, no. We absolutely have the ability to go ahead and use a gilui das, use an expression of intent to create a reality. So we'll say that is the machlokes. Incredible. The Abaye savar, Abaye holds gilui daita begita la milsihi. Abaye says expression of intent by a get doesn't affect reality. But Rava savar gilui daita begita mia milsihi. By the way, begita milsihi. Rava holds the halacha l'maisa expression of intent ultimately again, right? Gilui das is absolutely meaningful. Absolutely meaningful. All right, so the Gemara says, Amar Rava. So let's analyze this. So I'll say, Rava says, from where do I know that Gilui Das is effective? How do I know that an expression of intent, even though it's not an explicit expression of intent, works? Listen to this. So I'll say, great case. Rav Sheshes Ashkele Gitlahu Gavra Bal Karche. Rav Sheshes was administering a get against the husband's will. And I will say, we have not spoken about this case yet, but there is a concept, ultimately again, of forcing a husband to give a get. But 1 second, we're going to talk about a get mu'usa, which is a get that is given against the husband's will doesn't work. So I'll say we're going to discuss this very interesting, nuanced idea. How under certain circumstances we can go in and compel a husband to give a get, and it's treated as if it's given in accordance with his rasa, in accordance with his will. We'll get into it. In any event, let's just read the case for now. So what happens? Rav Sheshes is forcing a guy to give a get. Rav Sheshes said to the witnesses, Haki Amr L'chu Rav Sheshes. So we'll say, now watch this. So here's the case, right? Guy doesn't want to give the get. Rav Sheshes forces him to give the get. Fine. So now they're giving the get. The husband goes over to the witnesses and he says to them, Haki Amr L'chu Rav Sheshes li batal gita. So the husband says to the witnesses, I have a message from Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says the get is batal. So we'll say, so what is the husband doing? Right? The husband's trying to get out of the get. He's not saying, I'm being mevatel the get. Instead, what he's saying is, Rav Sheshes is being mevatel the get. So let's say, what is this? This is a case of gilui das, right? It's not explicit because he's not saying, I'm being mevatel the get. He's kind of making up a shtickle story over here that Rav Sheshes says to be mevatel the get. And yet, va'atzrechei Rav Sheshes kita achrina. And ultimately, again, I will say, based on this, Rav Sheshes required a writing of another get. Right? So I'll say, what do you see from here? So Rav says, you see from here that gilui daita begitin is milsihi. That an expression of intent, even though it's not an explicit expression of intent, ultimately works. We'll say, what will Abaye say in this case? Va'abaye, atu Rav Sheshes mevatel gita de inshihava. Ultimately, does Rav Sheshes have the ability to be mevatel other people's gittin? Of course not. Ihu de batle. Ultimately, it's the husband who was mevatel it. Va'ay de ka'amr lechu hachi mishum de panui. So I'll say, so if the husband is being mevatel the get, why does he blame it on Rav Sheshes? It's very simple. Say he was scared of Rav Sheshes's bouncers. Apparently, Rav Sheshes had some we call them guys, right? Like a shtickle like hooligans, right? Some muscle, right? He had muscle. He'll say, by the way, this is the way forcing people to write Gittin works, right? It's not that you're showing people the light. It's you're showing people a fist, right? So that's, and again, this is exactly how it works. It is actual physical coercion. We're going to talk about it. So this husband is scared because Rav Sheshes has his guys. Get some guys, by the way, right? Can you imagine? Also, sure, we got some guys. Anyway, so what happens? He has guys. So the husband is scared of the guys, and that's why he says Rav Sheshes said to him about all the get. Okay, so therefore we'll say. Ultimately, Abaye will say, it's not gilui daita, it's not an expression of intent, it's actual explicit expression of intent. Okay, Abaye says, Abaye says, from where do I glean my position? That gilui daita begitin lav milsihi, that an inexplicit expression of intent is not meaningful by Gittin. Where do I know that from? Listen to this. Rav Yehuda, ashkele gita, lechasnei Rabbi Yirmiyah birah. So let's listen to this. Rav Yehuda facilitated a get for the son-in-law of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, so what happens? Ubatle. So let's say the son-in-law, however, right, the husband was mevatel the get. Okay, Tana ashkale ubatle. So I'll say then what happened? Rabbi Yehuda had another get written. The husband was mevatel it again. So I'll say, so finally again, what happened? So Rabbi Yehuda had another get written for the husband, this time against his will, right? Al karche. Listen to this. Osivu kari bo'onaychu v'kasvule. So listen to this. And Rabbi Yehuda instructed the witnesses, Rashi says, put some pieces of gourd in your ear in order that you won't be able to hear those. In other words, we'll say earplugs. Put in earplugs, so that when the husband comes to go ahead and be mevatel the get, what's going to happen? You won't hear him. It's an interesting case. So the Gemara says, "V'i sagadaitcha gilui daita begita milsi." Now, 1 second, I'm going to say, if you hold that an inexplicit expression of intent is enough to be mevatel the get, hachazile tekarahet basraihu. Ultimately, what's going to happen? So, can you imagine this scene? So Rabbi Yehuda is fed up with the husband who is going to be mevatel the get. So, what does he tell the witnesses? Write the get, and puts. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, these cases sound a little bit strange because it sounds like the get is being done against the husband's will, right? We have not done this sugya yet about the mechanics of this, so we're missing a little piece information about how this works. don't get too caught up in that right now. What we're focusing on, the idea is of inexplicit statements, right? Inexplicit statements, ultimately, again, what's the effect of them or not? So watch this. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is telling the witnesses, put some gourd in your ear, put in some earplugs. This way, when the husband comes to Mevatel the get, you can't hear him. You can't hear him. To which the Gemara said, 1 second, but if you say an inexplicit expression of intent is enough to be Mevatel the get, I will say, remember, the witnesses are going to write the get. And what happens? The husband is running after them, and he's yelling. I will say, now what's the whole chap? Or I should say, he's running after them. Now they can't hear him because they've got gourd in their ear, right? So they can't hear him. But I will say, isn't the fact that he's running after them Gilui Daita, right? Gilui Das, isn't that an expression of intent? That he doesn't want the get. He's running after them. And I will say, yet, what do you see from here? And yet Abaye says, what do you see from here? That we don't care about that. We don't care about that. An inexplicit expression of intent, ultimately, again, is meaningless when it comes to get. I will Rava say about this case. But Rava, Haidi Karait Basar the Amr Lahu, Asher Haver Lei Hayo, Kihecha de Mishalim Sardahu Gavra. Rava says, no. Maybe the guy is running after the witnesses to say, quickly, finish up what it is so that my misery comes to an end. Right? Otherwise, I will say, maybe, you see, we assume that he's running after him in order to move out of the gate, but maybe not. Maybe he's actually running after the Eidim in order to say, come on, get the rose, literally, run, do this quickly, so that the misery, the suffering of this man should come to an end. Okay. So Abaye says, so once again, Abaye says, interesting case here. Abaye says, from where do I know that Gilui Das begin, that an inexplicit expression of intent ultimately is not enough to be Mevatel the get? From where do I know that? Dahuda Amar Lahu, Ilo Asina at Klasin Yomin. Let's listen to this. We saw this case already before. Right? Reuven gives a get to his wife. Now he gives it with a Tanai. What's the Tanai? If I don't come back in 30 days, right? So ultimately, again, the Havigita. So I will say classic Tanai. Here's your get. If I'm not back in 30 days, if I'm not back home in 30 days, the get is valid. What happened? Asa upanski mavra. So we'll say he makes it back, right? He's literally right at the border of the town within the proper amount of time. And what happens? Bridge collapse. Bridge collapse, right? And because of the bridge collapse, therefore what? He's unable to fully make it home. Amr lahu, chazudasai. See, he's jumping up and down. I'm here. Now let's say, what's the problem? He's not here, right? He's not here. He's on the other side of the bridge, and the bridge collapsed. Vamar Shmuel, lo shmei masya. And Shmuel says, ultimately, again, this is not called arriving, right? And therefore, again, the get is valid. Now, both say, the Gemara is suggesting, Abaye is suggesting, this is a case of Gilui Das, right? Rabbi say he's jumping up and down, and he's saying, I'm back, which effectively means what? He does not want the get to be valid. And yet what? The get is valid. So what do you see from here? That an inexplicit expression of intent, Gilui Das, is meaningless when it comes to Gittin. To which the Gemara says, no. Rava Amar, that's not true. Atu Hasan Levatule Gita, but say his intention when he jumps up and down is not to be Mevatel the get. His intention is what? So the Gemara says, Hasam the Kiyume Tnoy Kabai. Both say it's different. When he's jumping up and down, what he's saying is, I have fulfilled my condition. This is not a case of Bittel get, and this is not a case of Gilui Milsa. This is a case of Tanai. And essentially what he's saying about say is what? Listen, I'm back in order to fulfill the Tanai. I'm back within 30 days. The get should not be valid, but ultimately, again, there is an extenuating circumstance which is preventing me from ultimately fulfilling it. But I've done my best to fulfill the Tanai. And Abosai, we're going to see, we already learned this, by the way, this concept, that ein ones begitten, right? You can't claim extenuating circumstances when it comes to Gittin. In other words, you made a condition, you don't fulfill the condition. You tried, the bridge is down. Too bad. There's no extenuating circumstances by Gittin. Okay, we're supposed to say another case. ilo nesibna atlasin yomin lahavi Gita. So we'll say this is an interesting case. There was a man, apparently what happened was, here's the case. He did Kiddushin. Right after he did Kiddushin, he gave her a get. Now watch this. He gave her a get and he said to her, if I don't do Nisuin with you within 30 days, this get should be valid. Okay, interesting case. So we'll say what? First, say first wide line on the bottom of Lamed Daled on Daf 34a. Okay, Kimat Yom, 30 days go by. So Amr Lahu Hatarachna, and he says to her, listen, I'm really trying. Ultimately, I'm just not ready for the chasana. Right? I haven't finished cooking. I haven't secured the location, whatever it is. So we'll say what he's claiming over here is, I promise you, I'm really trying, but I'm not ready by the appointed date. To which the Gemara says, "L'may nechushla." So what should we be concerned for over here? Im yushum onsa ein ones begin. So I'll say if he's claiming extenuating circumstances, so I will say there is no claim of extenuating circumstances by Gittin. Fascinating idea. Ein ones begin. Furthermore, im yushum gilui daita begita plukta da'abai v'rava. Now, both say, here's what's interesting. So we'll say if he's claiming ones, okay, that's not a valid claim because ein ones begin. So we'll say maybe he's being mevatel the get, right? In other words, maybe when he says, I'm trying so hard to pull this together, essentially we'll say, what can you read into those words? I don't want the get. Now we'll say, is he saying, I don't want the get? Is he saying it? No. What he's saying is, I'm working really hard. So we'll say, that's gilui das. That's an inexplicit expression of intent. Well, that's a machlokes. Abaye and Rava. Okay. Hahuda Amr Lahu, Ilona Sibna L'Reish Yarcha, the Adar. Let's listen to this. Rosh Chodesh case. Incredible. What are the chances? A Rosh Chodesh case. So a man says, right, Reuven says to Rachel, if I don't marry you by Rosh Chodesh Adar, Lehavi Gita. Nabal says the same case. So remember again, the case over here is Reuven did Kiddushin with Rachel, gives her a get and says a conditional get. This is your get if I don't effect Nisuin by Rosh Chodesh Adar. Kimat Reishacha the Adar, when Rosh Chodesh Adar comes, Amr Lahu, Adam the Reishacha the Nisan, right? Amri. So he says, no, I didn't say Adar, I meant Nisan. Next month, I meant Nisan. So Lamai Necha. So what should we be concerned for? Imishum Ones. Say if he's claiming it's an Ones case, well, that's not going to work. In Ones begin. Imishum Gilui Daita. Now both say, now when he says not Adar Nisan, essentially we'll say, what is he saying? I don't want the get. That's what he's saying is, I don't want the get. So I'll say, so again, it's an inexplicit expression of intent. Well, that's plukta da Abaye v'Rava. So we'll say, that's ultimately, again, that's the machlokes Abaye and Rava. Okay, so we'll say, so now watch this. Look how this begins. V'hilchasa ki Nachman. So we'll say, the halacha follows of Nachman, number one. We'll say, listen, these kind of Gemaras are the best. Where the Gemara actually, we're about to start a new Mishnah, where the Gemara actually tells you a conclusion. Right? So number one, the halacha follows of Nachman. So we'll say, what does that mean? That's the Rav Nachman we started with today, that the halacha follows Rebbe in both cases. So therefore, bitlo mavotal, although Rabbi Gamliel said you are not supposed to convene a pop-up Beis Din and go ahead and be mevatel the get, not in the presence of the woman of the shaliach. If you did so, it works. So halacha, by the way, that's how the Rambam paskins as well, that bitlo mavotal, it's illegal, you shouldn't do it, but if you did it, it works. That's halacha number one. Halacha number two, Rabbi say, that you can't, that although when you appoint a group, if you want to cancel the agency of some of the members of the group, you should ideally do so in the presence of the entire group. But if you ended up canceling the agency of some, not in the presence of the whole, the cancellation still works. So that's halacha Rav Nachman like Rabbi v'hilchasa amud beis ki Nachmani. And we'll say the halacha follows Nachmani. Who's Nachmani? Rashi says over here, Abaye the Amar Gilui Daita Begita Lav Milsihi. Ultimately, and I will say, halacha l'maisa that the halacha follows Abaye. Because Nachmani is Abaye. We'll see why in just a moment. So Nachmani is Abaye that Gilui Milsa Begita Lav Milsihi. I will say, if you want to cancel a get, the only way to do that is with an explicit expression of intent. If you use some type of ambiguous wording, right? Inexplicit wording, it does not work. I will say, what a profound Musar Haskell as well. One of the most powerful tools we have in this world are words, is the koach hadibor. Prabhu say the way to properly use koach hadibor is to speak straight, is to speak openly, is to speak honestly, and to speak explicitly. When I see explicitly means say what you mean. Prabhu says it goes back to what we said yesterday, that so often in life, interpersonal strife is created because people don't really say what they mean and people don't really say what they feel. And often it comes from a good place. I don't want to be too explicit because I don't want to hurt someone, I don't want to this. But what happens is when ultimately people speak in ambiguities, all it does is it sows the seeds of confusion. Does a person have to know how to speak? Does a person have to know how to couch their words? Does a person have to know how to go? Because there are people who are very blunt speakers. What often happens with blunt speakers, they have very few friends, right? And generally people don't want to associate them because often they're just coarse and callous. There is a balance. There's the ability to speak, of course, in a refined, kind way, but also to go ahead and convey the actual things that I want to convey, and especially in relationships, I will say, the ability to speak openly and honestly, but still nicely and still sweetly is one of the most important things in order to create proper relationships. And that's the Gemara saying, Gilu milsa begita lav milsihi. I will say, listen to this. If an inexplicit expression of intent doesn't work to go ahead and affect divorce, it certainly doesn't work to solidify marriage as well. You want a good marriage, open lines of communication. Be explicit with what you want, with how you're feeling. If there are problems, if there are challenges, don't be afraid to talk it out. If Gilui Milsa doesn't work by Gittin, it certainly doesn't work by marriage. Incredible. So we'll say, why is Abaye called Nachmani? So Rashi says there's something very interesting. Rashi says Abaye was an orphan. Abaye was an orphan, and he was raised in the house of Rabba Bar Nachmani. He was raised by Rabba. So out of deference to his adopted home, he's often known as by Nachmani, right? By, so to speak, the surname of that particular family. Shabbos says, so that is the halacha l'maisa. We paskin like Rebbe in both of the first two cases. We paskin like Abaye, Gilui Milsa Bedaita Lav Milsa, Gilui Daita Begitin Lav Milsihi. Inexplicit expression of intent is not enough to negate, to void a get. And again, if explicit expressions of intent don't work for divorce, they certainly don't work to solidify marriage as well. Okay, I will say Mishnah. I will say this is really fascinating. We're now getting into some of the actual mechanics of Gittin. This is great. Barishona, Hayim Shana Shma Ushma V'Shemira. I will say in the beginning. I will say we're going to talk about now a guy who has two names. So again, let's say he has his given name and he has a nickname, or for example, he travels a lot and he's known in different in shul he's Ruvain, and he's Reuben. So as I said, now watch this. Very short in the beginning, Hayim Shana Shma Ushma. In the beginning, Rashi says over here, when a guy would have two names, they would only use the name he was known by in the place where the get was being written. That's what Rashi says over here. So I'll say in the beginning, even if a guy has two names, I don't mean like his name is like, Ruvain, Ruvain Chaim. I mean like he was known by two different names. So in the get, they would only include the name based on the place where the get itself was being written. Okay, his name, her name, the same of his city, name of his city, the name of her city. His Gamliel Hazakin Shaya Kosev Ish Ploni V'Chol Shum Sheyeshlo. Isha Plonis V'Chol Shum Sheyeshlo Mipnei Tikkun. So what's Rabbi Gamliel was mataking that ultimately again in a get you should go ahead and write Ruvain, and every name he is known by. And I will say there's a little bit of a machlokes exactly what this means. Do you say Ruvain and literally the phrase V'chol shum sheyeshlo, and any name that he has, or do you write Ruvain, who's also known the mystery Reuben, right? And actually go ahead and write in all of his names, and then the phrase V'chol shum sheyeshlo. So that's a machlokes. Happens to both say today in Gittin, when we write a get, and a guy is known, has a Hebrew name, and let's say he doesn't use his Hebrew name, he uses an English name, right? Or he has nicknames. We write all of that in the get. So if you have a guy whose name is Ruvain, but at work he goes by Reuben, and his nickname is Frank. So in the get they're gonna write Ruvain, Demiskari Reuben, Demiskari Frank, who's called, Miskari means he's called, V'chol Shum Sheyeshlo, and any other name by which he's known. I will say, the Rabbi Gamliel instituted this, Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam. We'll say why, because here was the problem. The problem, look at Rashi, Mishum Tikkun HaOlam, Shelo Yotzi Las Albana Min Hasheni, Leimar Lo Girsha Baila She'en Zeshmo. We'll say here's the problem. What were we concerned about? If Rachel gets divorced and her husband was Reuven, but no one knew Reuven as Reuven, he always knew he was known by the nickname Frank. So we'll say, so now what's the problem? Rachel's going to produce a get, right? And people are going to say the get, and what are they going to say? That's not Rachel's husband. Reuven's not Rachel's husband. Everyone knows his name was Frank. So what's going to happen? If she ends up getting married based on that get, it's going to be Motzi Laz. It's going to go ahead and cast aspersions on the legitimacy of the offspring from the second marriage. In order to avoid any type of confusion, we just put every name that each of the two spouses are known by, so say people should know that the get indeed is a valid get. Incredible. Some Rabbi Yehuda, Amr Shmuel. Let's listen to this. Shalchu b'lei b'dinas hayam Rabbi Gamliel. Supposed to listen to this. Listen to this. So they sent the following shaila from overseas to Rabbi Gamliel. Here's the shaila. Bnei Adam habayim misham lekan. So we'll say if you have a guy, right, or people who come from misham lekan, who come from Eretz Yisrael to Medinas Hayam. So we'll say now what's the case? Shmo Yosef v'koren lo Yochanan. So we'll say, let's say again, his name is Yosef, but they call him Yochanan. Yochanan, they call him Yosef, or his name is Yochanan, but they call him Yosef. Heich megarshin nishosein. How should they divorce their wives? Now, Rabbi say, so this is the shaila. So the shaila is, you have a husband who has two names. So therefore, again, which name ultimately, again, should be used in the get? So Rabbi Gamliel said, not a problem. Behiskin, shukosin ish ploni, v'choshum sheyeshlo, isha plonis v'choshum sheyeshla, mipnei tikkun ha'olam. So Rabbi says, this again, Bryce is just going in, of course. So Rabbi says, it's the same case of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Gamliel's into, you're right, solid point. Therefore, in the get, we're going to go ahead and use all names. Now, we'll say now an important caveat. What's the caveat over here? Ravashi, Behudi is chazik betrei shmei. Now, we'll say this is only true if what? If he's known to have twins. Now, we'll say the only time we include additional names, ultimately, again, is when the second name is used. As I will say, the fact that someone once called Reuven Jack, that is not by itself going to be enough. In order for the name to be included in the get, it has to be a name that is used. Ischazik Treshmei. Amali Rabbi Abba Ravashi, Rabbi Mari Rabbi Lazar, Kaimi Kavasech. So I'll say, so again, Rabbi Abba said to Ravashi that Rabbi Mari and Rabbi Lazar hold like you. Tanya Kavaseh Ravashi. So we'll say, Bryce that supports Ravashi, that the only time we include a second name is ultimately, again, when it's used. So let's listen to this. Listen to an interesting case. If a man was married to two women, Achas b'Yehuda v'Achas b'Galil. We'll say one lived in Yehuda and one lived in Galil. Below Shnei Shemos, and the guy has two names. Achas b'Yehuda v'Achas b'Galil. Now this is quite an interesting case. Now let's say these details go very much together, right? Bepashtos, if you have two wives, one in Yehuda, one in Galil, you might very well have two identities as well, right? Two social security numbers, right? A whole bunch of other stuff going on over here. Let's say, so what's the case? He's known, right? So he has two wives, one in Yehuda, one in Galil, and he's known by two different names, right? Two different names, one in Yehuda and one in Galil. And what happens? V'giresh es ishto shebi Yehuda, b'shmo shebi Yehuda. He divorced his wife in Yehuda with the name he's known by in Yehuda. And ultimately, again, then he divorces his wife in the Galil with his name in the Galil. Eina migurashas. The divorce is not valid. Ad she garish es ishto shebi Yehuda b'shmo shebi Yehuda v'shem the Galil imo. Ves ishto shebi Galil b'shmo shebi Galil v'shem Yehuda imo. So what does the Raisa say? The divorce is only valid if what? If what? He uses both names. He's got to use both names. Okay, Yatsa lemakom acher v'giresh be'echem megureshas. I will say, this is interesting. If, however, he went out to another place and divorced his wife with one of the names in a different place. In other words, he used either the name of Yehuda or the name of Galil in a different place. So what's the halacha? Migureshes. Ultimately, it works. I will say that's a stira. That's an inherent contradiction. So I will say, but you just said before that in order for divorce to be effective, ultimately he's got to use both names, the Yehuda name and the Galil name. Ela shmamina hadi ischazik. Hadalo is chazik shmamina. I will say, rather, what do you see from here? What's the fundamental distinction? The fundamental distinction, I will say, is one case is talking about where the second name was ischazik, and one case about a second name where it's not ischazik. See, the first part of the brisa that said that wherever he's divorcing his wife, in Yehuda or Galil, he has to use both names. That's when he's established. He is known by both of those names. Therefore, both of those names must appear on the get. The second part of the brisa, which says that he only has to use one of those names, is halacha l'maisa, talking about a case where he's only ischazik with one, but now, or I should say, he has one name, but the second name is not ischazik. In that case, it does not have to be included on the get. Incredible. Shema. So what you see over here is something very interesting, that as much as Rabbi Gamliel legislated that halacha l'maisa, you have to use both names in a get. You have to use, right, when a husband has multiple, but I'm saying husband, but say for husband and wife, right? Whichever one of the spouses is known by more than one name, all of the names they are known by have to be included in the get in order that there should not be any identity ambiguity. But when is that so? Rav Ashi says that's only if they're established in the use of both of those names. Good. Both sides finish off. Hahi Dahavakarli Miriam Upurta Sarah. There was a woman who was getting divorced, and I will say people called her Miriam, right? Some people called her Sarah. Some people called her Sarah. I will say, but it clearly was not a name that was ischazik. So Amri Nardai, Miriam v'choshim sheishla. In the get, you use the name Miriam, and you also include any other name that she has. Below Sarah v'choshim sheishla. So we'll say, now this is just the last point. If a person has a name, in this case, this one has two names. Her name is her name is Miriam, but some people called her Sarah. So we'll say, will we include Sarah in the get? Yeah, we'll include it. In other words, if it's a name that's used enough, we'll include it. But interestingly enough, which name do you put as the primary one? The name by which the majority of people call her. So even though some people call her Sarah, since the majority of people identify her as Miriam, therefore that is going to be the name. So I will say, so this is very important. So in other words, you'll write Miriam v'chol shum sheyeshla, Miriam, and any other name that she has. You would not write Sarah v'chol shum sheyeshla. I'll say, what's the difference? The difference is very important because, again, if one is a primary name and one is a secondary name, we always put the primary name first and either the secondary name second, or both say not put the secondary name at all, but just write v'chol shum sheyeshla. So both say, and that is indeed how we pass. It's like as I mentioned before, halacha l'maisa, the way we do Gittin today. Again, there's some deviation in practices as well, but l'maisa, if a person literally has a second name, the ischazik, that they are really known by, so we won't just write the phrase v'chol shum sheyeshla, but we'll actually include that second name in the get. All right, so we'll say shkoyach. We'll stop over here for today. A good chodesh. Incredible. All right, Chevra Zoom, have a great day, everyone. A good chodesh.